The observation deck of the human vessel Wanderer was quiet, except for the soft breathing of dragons, and Captain Amy Rodriguez sat in her chair watching the massive Krathon flagship through the viewscreen, while her fingers tapped a rhythm on the armrest because she had been waiting here for 3 hours, and patience was something humans had learned to practice when dealing with alien empires. Lyris stood by the window with her silver hair flowing down her back like starlight frozen in time, and her amber eyes reflected the cold metal of the enemy ship, and she wore simple clothing that humans had given her 2 centuries ago when she arrived on Earth as the last survivor of her world, and the dragons coiled around her body, sensed her tension because they always knew when their companion was remembering the past. Ember was the larger of the 2 dragons, and his scales shifted between deep purple and burning gold, depending on how the light caught them, and he stretched his wings, which could spread wide enough to fill half the cabin, and his eyes glowed with ancient intelligence as he watched the Krathon vessel, and wisps of smoke curled from his nostrils. Because dragons never forgot an enemy, Ash was smaller, and preferred to nest in Lyris's hair, where the silver strands provided warmth and comfort, and her scales were darker like storm clouds before rain, and she chirped softly as she communicated with Ember in the language that only dragons understood, and both of them knew what was about to happen, because they had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Amy checked the chronometer again and smiled, because the Krathon War Council was right on schedule, and humans had spent months studying the Empire's patterns and behaviors, and they knew exactly when the Council would meet and exactly what they would discuss. And this was the advantage that came from being patient and observant. While others were busy being arrogant, the communication system crackled to life, and Amy could hear the voices of hundreds of Krathon officers and diplomats gathering in their grand conference hall, and the translator converted their clicking and hissing into words that humans could understand, and she adjusted the volume so that Lyris could hear everything clearly. Lyris tilted her head, and her pointed ears twitched as she listened, and Ember growled low in his throat, and Ash became very still because they all recognized the tone and the words and the promises of conquest that the Krathon were making, and it was the same speech that the Empire had given 200 years ago when they came to the elf world. The Krathon Admiral Vexar began speaking, and his voice was full of pride and certainty as he described the human species as primitive and weak, and he told the War Council that humanity had rejected the Empire's generous offer of subjugation, and therefore they must be crushed and absorbed into the Empire, like all the other lesser species. Amy's smile grew wider because every word the Admiral spoke was being recorded and transmitted back to Earth, and to every human military installation across 3 star systems, and the Krathon had no idea that they were performing for an audience, and this was exactly what the human diplomatic corps had hoped would happen. Lyris closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and Amy could see the elf woman's hands trembling slightly because this was personal for her in ways that humans could understand but never truly feel. And the dragons sensed their companion's pain, and Ember pressed his warm body against her leg, while Ash nuzzled her cheek with a scaled snout. The War Council erupted in cheers as Admiral Vexar displayed holographic images of human colonies and described how easily they would fall, and he showed diagrams of Earth's defenses and pointed out all the weaknesses that Krathon intelligence had identified, and the assembled dignitaries raised their weapons and shouted their approval. Amy leaned forward, and her fingers hovered over the communication controls because timing was everything. In moments like this, and humans had learned that the best time to reveal your presence was when your enemy was most confident and most vulnerable, and right now the Krathon believed they were invincible. Lyris opened her eyes and looked at Amy and nodded once, and it was a gesture that carried 2 centuries of grief and determination and the promise of justice that had been delayed but never forgotten, and Ember spread his wings and Ash climbed onto Lyris's shoulder, and both dragons stared at the viewscreen with eyes that burned like small suns. The Krathon Admiral continued his speech and described the timeline for the invasion and how long it would take to conquer humanity, and he assured the War Council that within 6 months the human species would be either extinct or enslaved, and the Empire would claim all of their resources and technology. Amy watched the tactical display that showed the positions of every Krathon vessel in the Armada, and she noted their formations and their weapon configurations, and she compared it to the intelligence reports that human scouts had been gathering for months, and everything matched perfectly, because the Krathon were predictable when they thought they were safe. The War Council began voting on the declaration of war, and one by one, the representatives from conquered worlds raised their hands or appendages or whatever they used to signal agreement, and the holographic tally climbed higher and higher until it reached the threshold needed for unanimous approval. Admiral Vexar declared that the vote was complete and that the Krathon Empire was now officially at war with humanity, and he ordered his fleet commanders to begin preparations for the invasion and to ready their weapons and to prepare their soldiers for glorious conquest. Emmy took a deep breath and glanced at Lyris one more time, and the elf woman's face was calm, but her eyes blazed with fire that matched the dragon's, and she whispered something in the ancient language of her people, and Ember and Ash responded with sounds that were both beautiful and terrible. The captain's fingers moved across the controls, and she opened a communication channel that would broadcast directly to the Krathon flagship and to every vessel in their armada, and she made sure the signal was strong and clear and impossible to ignore or block. Then, Amy Rodriguez smiled and spoke in a voice that was friendly and casual and completely unconcerned, and she said hello to the Krathon War Council and mentioned that she had been listening to their very interesting conversation. The silence that followed. Amy's greeting was the kind of silence that happens when an entire room of people suddenly realizes something has gone terribly wrong, and the Krathon War Council froze in their seats, and their holographic displays flickered as their sensor operators scrambled to locate the source of the human transmission. Admiral Vexar's forearms spread wide in confusion and anger as he demanded to know how a human vessel had penetrated their security perimeter, and his mandibles clicked rapidly in a pattern that Amy's translator identified as extreme agitation, and the other council members began shouting questions and accusations at each other. Amy leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, and her voice remained cheerful as she explained that the Wanderer had been parked beside their flagship for approximately 3 hours and 14 minutes, and that human stealth technology was really quite good when they wanted to avoid being noticed. Lyris stepped closer to the communication console, and her presence seemed to fill the small cabin with something ancient and powerful, and Ember raised his head and stared at the view screen with eyes that glowed brighter, and Ash spread her wings and made a sound that was half purr and half growl. The Krathon sensor operators finally located the human ship, and their reports flooded the War Council chamber with panic, because the small vessel had been sitting in their primary defensive blind spot, and it had full view of their flagship and their fleet positions, and somehow their advanced detection systems had completely missed it. Amy pulled up a holographic display of her own, and she showed the Krathon exactly where the Wanderer was positioned, and she highlighted all the sensor data she had been collecting for the past 3 hours, and she mentioned casually that she had recorded the entire War Council session, including their vote to declare war on humanity. Admiral Vexar tried to regain control of the situation, and he announced that one small human ship meant nothing, and that the Empire would simply destroy it and continue with their invasion plans, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who commanded thousands of vessels and millions of soldiers. But Amy just laughed, and it was a genuine laugh full of amusement, and she told the Admiral that destroying her ship would be a very bad idea, and not just because it would mean killing a diplomatic vessel which was against every galactic law, but because of what would happen immediately afterward. Lyris finally spoke, and her voice cut through the chaos of the Krathon War Council like a blade made of ice and moonlight, and she introduced herself by her full name and her family line and the world she came from, and she explained that she was the last of her people, because the Krathon Empire had destroyed everything she loved 200 years ago. The effect was immediate and dramatic because even the Krathon kept records of their conquests, and the elf world had been one of their earliest victories, and it had also been one of their most brutal campaigns. And hearing a survivor speak from beyond what they thought was complete genocide sent waves of shock through the council. Ember roared, and it was not a loud sound, but something that resonated on frequencies that made every Krathon in that conference feel their organs vibrate, and Ash joined her larger companion with a shriek that carried harmonics of rage and vengeance, and together the dragons announced their presence to an empire that thought it had killed them all. Amy watched the tactical, display as Krathon ships began moving into defensive positions and their weapon systems came online, and their shield generators started charging, and she nodded approvingly because at least the Empire's military training was competent, even if their intelligence gathering was terrible. The captain activated another control and suddenly the view screen split into multiple images showing different locations around the Krathon home system, and Admiral Vexar stared in horror as 47 human warships decloaked simultaneously from positions that surrounded his Empire's most important world. Each human vessel was smaller than a Krathon dreadnought, but their weapon signatures were unlike anything the Empire had encountered before, and their shield configurations showed technology that was decades beyond what Krathon intelligence had estimated, and their positioning demonstrated tactical awareness that made the Admiral's primary hearts skip beats. Amy explained that these ships had been in position for approximately 1 week, and that they had been watching and waiting for the Krathon to make their declaration of war, and that humanity had learned a very important lesson from species like the elves about what happened when you were not prepared for aggressive empires. Lyris moved to stand directly in front of the view screen, and her silver hair seemed to glow in the light from the tactical displays, and Ember climbed onto her shoulder while Ash remained perched on the other side, and together they looked like something from ancient myths and legends. The elf woman told the War Council that she had spent 2 centuries with humanity and that she had watched them grow from a species that barely understood space travel into something that made even old empires nervous, and she explained that humans had one quality that the Krathon had never developed, which was the ability to learn from other people's mistakes. Admiral Vexar demanded proof that the human ships were real and not some kind of holographic trick, and Amy smiled and gave a signal, and one of the human warships fired a single shot that passed within 10 meters of a Krathon patrol vessel, and the energy discharge was enough to overload every sensor on the patrol ship and leave it floating dead in space. The shot had been calculated perfectly to demonstrate power without causing permanent damage, and the Krathon War Council understood the message immediately, because this was humanity, showing restraint while also showing capability, and that combination was more frightening than simple aggression. Lyra spoke again, and her voice carried memories of burning forests and dying friends, and a world that had fought bravely, but lost everything, and she told the Krathon that the dragons remembered every detail of that day, and that they had been waiting for this moment with patience that only immortal creatures could manage. Ember breathed a small gout of flame that reflected in the view screen and created dancing shadows across Lyris's face, and Ash chirped in a way that sounded almost like laughter, because dragons understood irony, and there was something deeply ironic about the Empire facing judgment from the species they thought they had exterminated. Amy checked her chronometer and announced that the Krathon had approximately 90 seconds to withdraw their declaration of war and issue a formal apology and agree to open peace negotiations, or humanity would be forced to demonstrate exactly why 47 warships was more than enough. The War Council erupted into arguments and accusations and desperate calculations, and Admiral Vexar tried to maintain order, but his authority was crumbling because everyone could see the tactical situation and everyone understood that the Empire had walked into a trap that had been set months ago. The Krathon War Council descended into chaos as different factions began shouting at each other, and Admiral Vexar's forearms gestured frantically as he tried to restore order, while simultaneously processing the impossible situation that humanity had created, and his tactical officers were feeding him data that made his primary and secondary hearts race with fear. Amy Rodriguez watched the pandemonium with calm satisfaction, and she sipped from a container of coffee that had gone cold during the long wait, and beside her, Lyris remained perfectly still like a statue carved from moonlight and ancient sorrow, and the dragons had gone quiet in that way that predators do when they are watching prey decide its own fate. The largest faction in the War Council consisted of military commanders who believed that the Empire should attack immediately because 47 ships could not possibly stand against the thousands of vessels that the Krathon commanded, and they argued that humanity was bluffing and that their technology could not be as advanced as the sensor readings suggested. But another faction, made up of older diplomats and conquered species representatives, urged caution because they had seen what happened when empires underestimated younger species, and they pointed out that humanity had demonstrated perfect intelligence gathering and tactical positioning, and that perhaps the Empire should consider that these 47 ships were only what humans wanted them to see. Amy listened to both arguments through her translator, and she made notes on her tablet because human military intelligence would want detailed psychological profiles of Krathon decision-making processes, and every word spoken in that council chamber was valuable data for future negotiations or conflicts. Lyris finally moved, and she walked closer to the view screen until her face nearly touched the display, and she spoke directly to Admiral Vexar in a voice that was soft, but carried the weight of 200 years of survival and loss, and she asked him if he remembered the elf world, and if he had been there when the forests burned. The Admiral's mandibles stopped clicking, and his eyes, which were compound and multifaceted, reflected the light in strange patterns, and he admitted that he had been a junior officer during that campaign, and that he remembered the elves fighting with weapons that seemed to sing, and dragons that burned Krathon ships from the sky. Ember growled and smoke poured from his nostrils in thick streams, and Ash spread her wings wide, and both dragons stared at the Admiral with recognition, because dragons never forgot faces or voices or the smell of enemies, and 2 centuries meant nothing to creatures who could live for thousands of years. Lyris told the Admiral that she had been young when the Krathon came, and that she had watched her family die and her forests burn and her dragons fall from the sky with broken wings and burning scales. And she explained that the only reason she survived was because one dying dragon had used the last of its strength to throw her into an escape pod. The War Council fell silent as Lyris described how she had drifted in space for weeks before a human exploration vessel found her pod and brought her to Earth, and how the humans had given her sanctuary without asking for anything in return, and how they had helped her save the last 2 dragon eggs that she had clutched in her arms. Amy added that humanity had spent considerable time studying the history of the Krathon Empire and its pattern of conquest and subjugation, and they had noticed that the Empire always targeted species that were peaceful or unprepared or too trusting, and that humanity had decided they would not fall into any of those categories. The captain pulled up another display that showed economic data and trade routes and diplomatic communications, and she demonstrated that humanity had been building alliances with dozens of other species for years, and that many of these species were former Krathon subjects who remembered their own lost worlds. Admiral Vexar realized that he was not just facing 47 human warships, but potentially facing a coalition of species that humanity had been organizing specifically to counter Krathon expansion, and his tactical mind understood that this changed everything about the strategic situation. Lyris touched the view screen with her fingertips, and her amber eyes seemed to glow with inner fire, and she told the Admiral that the dragons had made her a promise when they hatched from those eggs, and that promise was that someday the Krathon Empire would answer for what it had done. Ember and Ash both roared together, and the sound was not loud in the physical sense, but it carried through the communication channel, with harmonics that made every Krathon feel something primal and ancient and terrifying, and it was the sound that prey animals hear in their nightmares. Amy glanced at her chronometer and announced that 60 seconds had passed, and that the Krathon now had 30 seconds remaining to make their decision, and she suggested that they consider very carefully what they wanted their empire's legacy to be. The War Council erupted into frantic debate, and several representatives demanded that the Empire withdraw the declaration immediately, while others insisted that showing weakness would encourage other species to rebel, and Admiral Vexar found himself caught between impossible choices. But then one of the older diplomats stood up, and his species had been conquered by the Krathon 300 years ago, and he pointed out that the Empire had always survived by being practical rather than prideful, and that sometimes the strongest action was knowing when to step back. Amy watched as the tide slowly turned in the council chamber, and she could see Admiral Vexar's body language change as he began to accept what his tactical displays were telling him, and she knew that the Empire was going to make the smart choice even if it hurt their pride. Lyra stepped back from the view screen, and she placed one hand on Ember's head and the other on Ash's neck, and she whispered something in the language of her lost world. And the dragons responded, with gentle sounds that were completely different from their earlier roars. The elf woman told the War Council that she did not want revenge in the form of destruction, because that would make her no better than the Empire that had destroyed her home, and instead she wanted the Krathon to understand what they had done, and to face the consequences of their actions through justice rather than violence. Amy nodded in agreement, and she explained that humanity preferred diplomatic solutions, when possible, but that they were fully prepared for military solutions when necessary, and that the choice belonged entirely to the Krathon Empire. Admiral Vexar raised all four of his arms in a gesture that meant surrender or submission in Krathon culture, and he announced to the War Council that he was recommending immediate withdrawal of the war declaration and formal negotiations with humanity. The vote was quick this time, and nearly unanimous, because even the most aggressive military commanders could see the tactical display and understand that the Empire had been outmaneuvered and outthought, and that continuing down this path would lead to disaster. Amy smiled and told the Admiral that humanity accepted their withdrawal and that diplomatic teams would arrive within 48 hours to begin peace negotiations, and that one of the conditions would be formal recognition of past crimes against species like the elves. The transmission ended, and Amy Rodriguez sat back in her chair and let out a long breath that she had been holding for what felt like hours, and the tension that had been building in her shoulders finally released, and she rolled her neck until it cracked and popped. And then she smiled at Lyris, who was still standing by the view screen. The elf woman turned slowly, and her silver hair moved like water in low gravity, and Ember stretched his wings and yawned, showing teeth that were small but incredibly sharp, and Ash climbed down from Lyris's shoulder and flew in lazy circles around the cabin because the dragons knew that the immediate danger had passed. Amy stood up and walked over to Lyris, and she placed a hand on the elf woman's shoulder and asked if she was all right, and Lyris nodded, but her amber eyes were wet with tears that she had been holding back for 2 centuries, and finally, she was allowing herself to feel. The captain understood that this moment was about more than just preventing a war, and it was about justice for a species that had been erased from the galaxy, and about giving voice to all the victims of the Krathon Empire who had never been able to speak. And Amy knew that Lyris needed time to process everything. Ember landed on the console and folded his wings and looked at Amy with eyes that held intelligence and gratitude, and the dragon made a sound that was almost like a purr. And Amy scratched behind his ears the way she had learned he liked, and Ember leaned into her touch. Ash joined her companion, and both dragons pressed against Amy's hands, and the captain felt the warmth of their scales and the vibration of their breathing. And she understood why Lyris loved these creatures so deeply, because they were not pets but family and friends and the last connection to a world that was gone. The communication system beeped, and Amy returned to her chair and accepted an incoming transmission from Earth, and the face that appeared on the screen belonged to Admiral Katie Morrison, who was the commander of human diplomatic operations, and her expression showed relief mixed with satisfaction. Morrison congratulated Amy on the successful mission and confirmed that all 47 warships had received the stand-down order and were returning to their patrol routes, and she added that the diplomatic teams were already preparing for the negotiations with the Krathon, and that the president herself wanted to thank Amy personally. Amy shrugged and said that she had just done her job, and that the real credit belonged to the intelligence officers who had predicted the Krathon behavior so accurately, and to the engineers who had developed the stealth technology that made the whole operation possible. But Admiral Morrison shook her head and explained that Amy had been chosen for this mission specifically because she understood the importance of what Lyris represented, and because she had the diplomatic skill to handle a situation that could have easily turned into a shooting. War Lyris stepped into view of the camera, and Morrison's expression softened, and the Admiral said that the human government wanted to offer formal support for any efforts to document and preserve elf culture and history, and that Earth's best xenoarchaeologists were ready to help if Lyris wanted them. The elf woman smiled, and it was the first genuine smile that Amy had seen from her in weeks, and Lyris thanked the Admiral and said that she would like that very much, and that perhaps it was time to make sure her people were remembered as more than just victims of the Krathon Empire. Morrison promised that resources would be allocated and that humanity took its responsibilities to refugee species very seriously, and then she ended the transmission, with orders for Amy to return to Earth for debriefing and probably some mandatory rest, because the captain had been on deployment for 4 months. Amy closed the channel and began plotting a course back to human space in the navigation computer. calculated that it would take approximately 6 days at standard cruising speed, and she programmed the autopilot to handle the routine parts of the journey. Lyra sat down in the co-pilot chair and stretched her legs, and Ember immediately claimed her lap while Ash perched on the headrest, and both dragons settled in for what they knew would be a long, quiet trip through space. The captain activated the ship's engines, and the Wanderer detached from its hidden position beside the Krathon flagship. And as they moved away, Amy looked at the massive Imperial vessel one last time, and she felt a sense of satisfaction that came from winning without firing. A single shot. Lyris watched the stars scroll past the view screen, and she asked Amy how humans had known that the Krathon would respond to diplomatic pressure instead of just attacking anyway. And Amy explained that humanity had been studying aggressive species for decades, and they had learned that bullies usually backed down when they realized their target was not helpless. The elf woman nodded and said that her people had believed in peaceful solutions too, and that they had tried to negotiate with the Krathon, but the Empire had not been interested in peace back then. And Lyris wondered what had changed. Amy suggested that perhaps nothing had changed about the Krathon, but that the galaxy had changed around them, and that younger species were learning from the mistakes of older ones, and that empires built on conquest eventually ran out of targets who would not fight back. Ember made a rumbling sound that might have been agreement, and Ash chirped something that made Lyris laugh, and the dragons communicated in their private language, and Amy realized that she would never fully understand the bond between the elf woman and her companions. The journey back to Earth passed quietly, and Amy spent most of her time writing detailed reports about the mission, while Lyris worked on her own project, which involved documenting everything she could remember about elf culture and language and history. The dragons spent their time doing whatever dragons did when they were not needed for intimidation, and Amy noticed that they seemed to enjoy watching old human movies, especially ones with space battles and adventure, and Ember had developed a particular fondness for westerns on. The fourth day, Lyris showed Amy some of the writing she had been working on, and it was beautiful in a way that made the captain's throat tight, because it described a world full of music and light and forests that sang with the voices of ancient trees. Amy read about elf cities that grew from living wood and about dragons that were not just companions but partners in a civilization that had lasted thousands of years, and about a culture that valued art and knowledge and harmony with nature. And she read about the day the Krathon came, and how the elves had tried to surrender, and how the Empire had killed them anyway because they wanted the elf world's resources and did not care about the people who lived there. Lyris explained that she was writing this not for herself, but for the future, and for any other species that might face the same choice that her people had faced. And she wanted them to know that sometimes peace was not possible, and that preparation was not the same as aggression. Amy promised that humanity would make sure the elf story was told and taught and remembered, and that it would be part of the curriculum in every human school, so that children would understand why their species had chosen to be ready. The Wanderer entered Earth's solar system on the 6th day, and Amy Rodriguez felt a familiar sense of relief that came from returning home after a dangerous mission, and the blue planet grew larger on the view screen, and Lyris leaned forward in her seat because even after 2 centuries, she still found Earth beautiful in ways that reminded her of the world she had lost. Ember and Ash both woke from their napping, and they pressed their faces against the view screen and made excited sounds because the dragons had been born on Earth, and it was the only home they had ever known, and they loved the planet with an intensity that sometimes surprised Amy. The communication system came alive with traffic control messages and docking instructions, and Amy guided the ship through the standard approach pattern that brought them toward the orbital station that served as humanity's primary diplomatic hub. Admiral Morrison was waiting for them at the docking bay, and she was not alone because the human president had decided to personally welcome them back, and Amy felt her stomach twist with nerves because she was much better at handling alien empires than important ceremonies. Lyris smoothed her silver hair and adjusted her clothing and whispered something to the dragons, and both Ember and Ash settled onto her shoulders in a way that made them look regal and impressive rather than cute, and Amy realized that the elf woman understood the importance of appearances. The airlock cycled, and the door opened, and Amy stepped through, first followed by Lyris and the dragons, and Admiral Morrison saluted, and the president extended her hand and said that the entire human government was grateful for what they had accomplished, President Helen Chen was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes, and she had led humanity through some of its most difficult diplomatic challenges, and she looked at Lyris with genuine respect and told her that Earth considered the elf people to be honored friends. Lyris bowed in the way of her people, and Ember and Ash both dipped their heads, and the president smiled and said that she had arranged for a formal ceremony, but that it could wait until after everyone had rested and eaten proper food. Amy appreciated that because she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, and Lyris looked like she needed time to process everything that had happened, and the dragons were getting restless from being cooped up in a small ship for 6 days. They were escorted to quarters in the diplomatic section of the station, and Amy's room was comfortable and familiar, and she collapsed onto the bed without even removing her boots and slept for 14 hours straight. When she woke up, she showered and changed into clean clothes and made her way to the cafeteria, where she found Lyris sitting by a window, with the dragons eating what looked like fresh fruit and synthetic meat. The elf woman invited Amy to join her, and they ate together in comfortable silence, while watching Earth rotate below them, and Amy noticed that Lyris seemed more relaxed than she had been in months. Ember and Ash finished eating and flew off to explore the station, because the dragons were curious creatures, and the diplomatic section had high ceilings and wide corridors that gave them room to stretch their wings. Lyris told Amy that she had been thinking about what came next, and that she wanted to be part of the negotiations with the Krathon because her voice needed to be heard, and her people's story needed to be told directly. Amy agreed and said that she would speak to Admiral Morrison and make sure that Lyris had a place at the negotiating table, and that humanity would support whatever justice the elf woman thought was appropriate. The ceremony happened 2 days later in the main assembly hall, and Amy wore her formal uniform, which she hated because it was stiff and uncomfortable, and Lyris wore a dress that human designers had created based on her descriptions of elf formal wear. The president gave a speech about courage and diplomacy and the importance of standing up to bullies, and she presented Amy with a medal that came with a promotion to commander, and Amy accepted it gracefully, even though she felt awkward standing in front of so many important people. Then the president turned to Lyris, and the entire hall fell silent, and Helen Chen spoke about loss and survival and the responsibility that humanity felt toward species that the Krathon had harmed, and she announced that Earth was establishing a memorial and research center dedicated to preserving elf culture. Lyris tried to thank the president, but her voice broke and tears ran down her face, and Ember and Ash both flew to her and wrapped themselves around her shoulders, and the dragons made sounds that were meant to comfort and protect. The president waited until Lyris had composed herself, and then she said that there was one more thing, and she gestured to the back of the hall, where a group of xenoarchaeologists entered carrying something covered in cloth. The cloth was removed, and underneath was a fragment of carved wood that had been recovered from the debris field where the elf world used to be, and it was part of a tree that had been shaped and grown into living architecture, and it was one of the only pieces of the elf civilization that still existed. Lyris walked slowly toward the fragment, and she placed her hands on the wood and closed her eyes, and Amy saw the elf woman's lips moving in what must have been a prayer or poem in her native language. The dragons flew around the fragment and sang, and it was a sound that nobody in the hall had ever heard before, and it was beautiful and heartbreaking, and it filled the space with something ancient and holy. After the ceremony, Amy and Lyris returned to the diplomatic quarters, and they sat together by the window and watched the stars, and the elf woman thanked Amy for everything and said that for the first time in 2 centuries she felt like her people's death had meaning. Amy said that meaning was something people created through their choices, and that Lyris had chosen to survive and to remember, and to help humanity understand the cost of not being prepared, and that was a gift that could not be measured. The negotiations with the Krathon began the following week, and Lyris sat at the table across from Admiral Vexar and other Empire representatives, and she told them about her world, and her family, and what had been lost. The Krathon listened, and some of them looked ashamed and others looked angry, but they all listened because humanity had made it clear that there would be no treaty without accountability. The Empire agreed to create a fund for reparations to surviving members of conquered species, and to open their historical archives so that the true story of their expansion could be documented, and to accept observers who would monitor their treatment of subject worlds. It was not perfect justice, but it was something, and Lyris told Amy that she could accept it, because the alternative was more war and more death, and she had seen enough of both. Amy received her next assignment 3 months later, and it was another diplomatic mission to another species that was considering conflict with humanity, and Admiral Morrison asked if she wanted Lyris to accompany her. The elf woman agreed immediately, and Ember and Ash expressed their approval by doing loops in the air, and Amy smiled because she had gotten used to having companions who understood what she was trying to accomplish. As the Wanderer prepared to depart Earth, Lyris stood at the view screen one last time and looked at the planet that had given her sanctuary, and she whispered a promise that she would use her second chance to make sure no other species suffered the way her people had. Amy heard the promise and nodded, and together they flew back into the darkness between stars, carrying the memory of a lost world and the hope that the galaxy could learn to be better than its past.